Hey everyone, I'm Andy Anderson, co-owner of AVAIYA University with my partner Ike Allen. Thank you so much for joining us for our Breaking Free from Codependency curriculum. We have a great class lined up for you today with Dr. Valerie Mason-John. She's going to be talking with us about the codependency of racism. Valerie and I dive into what the codependency of racism is, what the origin of this codependency is and how it affects our society today, what trauma bonding is, how to practice mindfulness, and how to overcome the codependency of racism, and so much more. Thanks so much for joining us and enjoy the class. Hello, everyone. Welcome to AVAIYA's Breaking Free from Codependency curriculum. I'm Andy Anderson. My partner Ike Allen and I are teachers, mentors, and the co-owners of AVAIYA University. AVAIYA is the creator of over 1,000 books, films, courses, teachings, and other supportive resources. Thank you so much for joining us. Our fellow teacher, Dr. Valerie Mason-John, is here to talk with us today about the codependency of racism. Valerie is one of the leading African-Canadian voices in the field of mindfulness approaches for addiction and trauma. She is an ordained Buddhist who has developed an accredited mindfulness program for addiction and co-founded 8-step recovery meetings that are hosted in several continents. She is the author of 9 books, including her recent titled I Am Still Your Negro, and Homage to James Baldwin, which is a social justice poetic narratives response to the inequities in society. She is also a featured teacher on AVAIYA University's Breaking Free from Abandonment and Betrayal event. So welcome back, Valerie.
Yeah, it's great to be back. Thank you for inviting me back, Andy. Andy.
Yeah, I know. We have different pronunciations. Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for saying yes. I always love talking with you, Valerie. And obviously, this is a very important topic that we're talking about today, given what's going on in our interesting world. So let's dive into this talk. So what is the codependency of racism?
Yeah, well, Andy, when you asked me to be part of this summit and talk about codependency, I sat and reflected on it. And I came to this realization of this codependency of racism. Because if you think of codependency of taking care of somebody else's dysfunction, which is part of codependency, taking care of somebody else's dysfunction. That's what we as African descent people have been doing for years, taking care of white people's dysfunction, which is why you've seen this whole destruction of the mythos. You've seen statues being tumbled. I think there's been about 12 statues that have been tumbled in the US and many more statues tumbled around the world. And so the reason why I coined this as the codependency of racism is that actually we didn't say anything. We've been living in this world looking at statues of people who glorified slavery, looking at Confederate flags, which have been a symbol of white supremacy. And we haven't done anything about it. And if we think of some of the things, some of the core things around codependency, having difficulty about identifying your feelings. Well, we as Black people have had to suppress our feelings. Now in the world, they've just erupted, but we have suppressed our feelings far too long. Having difficulty communicating in relationships is another aspect of codependency. And I would say that many Black people have had difficulty communicating in relationships with white people because we're afraid that we'll be called intimidating. We're afraid that we'll be called aggressive. We're afraid that we'll be called difficult. And so what we do is we've made ourselves smaller so that we can pass in the world. And then there's this whole thing of valuing the approval of others more than valuing ourselves. And so we as Black people in this world have had a lot of low self-esteem. And some of us have internalized this systemic racism. And we've valued the white world more than we have our own. It's like sometimes I meet people and I say, what's your name? And they say, oh, my name is Sally. And I say, no, tell me really what your name is. Oh, well, it's difficult. You won't understand it. And I say, listen, you're talking to another Black person. I want to know what is your name. And then they will tell me what their actual African name is or what their Indian name is. But they've changed their name to make white people feel comfortable. Okay?
Yeah.
So this is why I call this the codependency of racism. Because also, if you look at some of this codependent behavior, this is what happens in this codependent behavior. It trickles into our own relationships with each other. With codependent behavior, we can become like a victim, and so we perceive ourselves a victim of racism, and then we're going to then begin to perceive ourselves as a victim in our relationships. Then there's this whole thing of the adaptation of lying and bad behavior, and this can spill into our behavior, into our relationships. The whole thing of pleasing people because we've had to please white people, that filters into our relationships. The whole thing of taking everything personal, because in the white world, things happen, it becomes personal. All of a sudden something happens and it's because I'm Black. It's because of this. And sometimes it isn't because I'm Black or because I'm brown, but something happens and we make it personal. This filters into our relationships. And then there's this whole thing of guilt and shame. And all of this filters into our relationships. And I really want to say that the codependency of racism, to me, is a matter of life and death. And the reason why I say this, Andy, is because you go to some African countries, do you know the homophobic laws that we have in Africa didn't come from Africa. It came from the British. These are old laws from the 18th century. And in some African countries, being in a homosexual relationship, in a queer relationship, you can be killed for that. You can be stoned to death for that. And we carry on. It's like we acquiesce, we carry on as if this is the right thing to do. And these laws have come from the British. And actually, when you go back into some of our cultures, into African cultures or into Asian cultures, same-sex relationships were normal. It was part of life. So this is why I talk about this codependency of racism. And hallelujah, things are changing. As I say, people out there on the streets, it's the destruction of the mythos. No longer are we going to be codependent. It's again, Andy, and then I will pause. Many of us have tried to be the good nigger. Okay, we've tried to get the job. We've got the education, but yet we're still the nigger on the streets. They're still killing us. It doesn't matter if we've got the PhD or if we've got the masters or if we've got the good job. They're still killing us. It doesn't matter if we're looking after your children. They're still killing us. But now something has happened. The destruction of the mythos. No longer are many of us going to be codependent. We're speaking up because we've tried doing it the other way and it hasn't worked. So this is why I talk about the codependency of racism.
Whew. So what's the solution? What do you see is happening that is part of the solution right now? Speaking up, speaking out, what are your thoughts on how to overcome this codependency of racism?
Before I answer that question, what I've said to you, does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Yeah. Just really, yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm all teary over here.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Just that thing of just being heard. And that's part of the solution. to be able to be heard, because we haven't been heard. George Floyd wasn't heard. Eric Garner wasn't heard. Trayvon Martin wasn't heard. Ahmaud Arbery wasn't seen. And I can list a whole catalogue of names where we haven't been heard. And now it's like, okay, we've played it your way. We've played into that. If it's by being out on the streets and having that trauma bonding, to get ourselves heard. And also, as you say, what's the solution? Part of the solution is the ally work, because the only way we are going to be heard if white people hear us and they begin to speak up for us, just as some of those white people did during slavery, just as some of those white abolitionists spoke up for us. There are some white abolitionists who were killed for speaking up for us. But that's part of the solution. White people have to hear us, okay? They have to hear us. And I think something is beginning to change, that white people are beginning to hear us. Yeah. That's part of the solution. And part of the solution is not making ourselves small anymore. Is really stepping into our epigenetic wisdom. There's so often our bodies are politicized, they're traumatized, and okay, we can't separate the political from the personal, but whenever we talk about black and brown bodies, it's about the trauma, it's about the injustices, it's about the slavery, it's about what we've been through. But what about the wisdom, the thousands of years of wisdom that we have in our cultures? And we have to start stepping into that. But again, what's the solution? The white world has to begin thinking, why are we the most incarcerated race in the world? Not just in the prisons, but even in the mental health institutions. Yeah. We have to asking, why are we killing each other? This is a legacy. This is a legacy of slavery. This is the legacy of white supremacy. Yeah. Not say, oh, well, they're just killing each other. Why are we doing it? We've lost our self-esteem. So we as a Black community have to come together and begin to step into our power and have our voices heard.
So how do you suggest people watching cultivate that self-esteem if they're feeling small, unheard, lacking in self-esteem? How does one generate that?
Connection. One of the ways we generate that is connection. And one of the positive things of COVID-19 is this whole world that has opened up on the internet. Before people like, I don't want to do stuff on the internet. But now,
right.
Not everybody, but a larger population is on the internet. And what's actually happened is these Black communities have sprung up on the internet. It's like people are meeting in Brazil and in Black groups, people are meeting in the US, in Europe. Connection. We need to begin talking to each other. And what happened? This is why the uprisings have been so powerful, because we have this internet and we can see what's happening. It's almost like we have been communicating. If we don't actually have to be in connection by talking like this, but actually all around the world, people have been uprising, toppling statues. That is connection. We need connection we need to speak. We need to speak up about some of these injustices, okay? Because many of those people on the streets have experienced the injustices, but they survived. They were lucky. They weren't killed. But who did they speak to? Yeah. And we have to start being authentic. And being authentic is having our voice, is speaking to each other. What can we do? Creating these healing circles. And at the same time, white people creating their healing circles, as Rasme Menachem, and sorry Rasme if I said your name wrong, I'm a bit dyslexic, but in his book, Grandmother's Hands, he talks about white supremacy living in all our bodies, not just living in white bodies, but black bodies, brown bodies, and we all have to do the healing. This is the time when we are all doing the healing. It's not just black and brown bodies who have to heal from this slavery, the impact, the legacy of slavery. White bodies have to heal from the legacy of slavery. And so I think one of the things we have to look at, what is the origin of codependency? And we can see initially the origin in our childhoods. So as a black mother raising black children, what does that mother have to tell that black child? Yeah, don't speak out. Don't speak up. Yeah. Be a good nigger. Okay. Yeah. And what is the origin in your families and white families? What are white families telling their children about black people? Because for me, when I think of those police officers, especially Chauvin, especially, what was his story? What was his story? What was he impacted by? Yeah, because people don't just do that. Yeah, and we know it's still, the Ku Klux Klan is still out there. Okay, even in England, where one of the statues was toppled in Bristol, the next day, white fascists went and actually destroyed some graves of black slaves. They went to a cemetery, and where, you know, black slaves headstones were, they destroyed them and said, if you don't put that statue back up, there will be more. Okay? So this is the world that we're living in, and we have to begin to change this world. So what can we do as black people? What can we do when we're raising our children? And it's really hard, because after the George Floyd, as a meditation teacher, as a mindfulness teacher, how do we teach black and brown bodies to breathe again? Yeah. Still, when I am walking along the street and a police car passes, I stop and hold my breath. I stop. That codependent behavior make it easier for the police car, and I stop. Why can't I carry on walking? A couple of years ago, I was in the States walking with my white friend. Police car passed us. I stopped. She carried on walking. Yeah. And how do we teach black and brown bodies that if a police car passes us, it's okay to keep on walking? So it's not just about the revolution inside us. This is why we talk about systemic racism, because it's the institutions that have to change. Because if the institutions don't change, then I am going to continue being codependent, because it's an adaptation that will save me, hopefully save me, because it doesn't always save me, but help me survive in this world. So the institutions have to change. Not by let's rushing and getting another black or brown body to be on your board, or another black and brown body to be on your summit, or another black and brown body to be part of your workforce. No, you have to really look at the values and the belief systems within your institution. You have to look at the values and the belief systems within the individuals who create that institution. You have to look at the beliefs and values which initially brought the institution into being. And it may be that that institution has to collapse and a new one has to come from the ashes. Mm. Yeah. So for as long as this systemic racism survives, many of us are going to be codependent, because it's, how can I say to somebody, just be yourself, just, how can I say to somebody, if a policeman stops you, be quiet, don't do anything, that's not going to save you. How can I empower and enable black and brown bodies not to be codependent? Mm. And the thing is, it impacts our relationships with other black people, with other brown people. Yeah, it impacts our relationships.
Share more about that, how that impacts.
Because then we have a distrust of each other, because we where do we learn distrust? So if we've got distrust in our relationships, it comes from our rearing, our childhood. Yeah, and we learn to distrust people. We learn to distrust. It just spills over into our relationships. Yeah, and then it's like the whole conflict. It's if you've got two parents raising a black child, one parent wants to raise the child this way, another parent wants to raise the child another way. And both of them want the best outcome. Both of them don't want their child killed by the police. But who's going to be right? Yeah. And both of those people will have values and belief systems which they got from childhood, which is going to be the best way. That's the conflict. Mm. So it really has an impact on our communities.
What's trauma bonding? You mentioned that a little while ago, and I'm curious to explore that a little bit more. What does that mean, and how does that relate to this topic of codependency of racism?
For me, how I see trauma bonding is that we recognize another person's trauma and bond. I was somebody who I used to connect at the wound. That was trauma bonding. Connect at the wound, which again is a codependent behavior, is connecting at the wound. I would connect at the wound because I told myself that I could help save another person. I was familiar, so we connect at the wound. So again, with these uprisings on the streets, people have connected at the wound, bonded on the wound, because the people out on the streets are traumatized. Traumatized. Connecting at the wound, bonding at the wound. And how can we help each other? Yeah. So that's what I see as trauma bonding, is connecting at the wound. I've learned differently now, is to connect at the place of joy, because there's always going to be the wound which will emerge. But why do I have to focus on the wound, but connect at the place of joy?
Mm. Yeah. Do you, I know you talk a lot about addiction in your work. Do you think codependency is an addiction?
Well, it depends how you define addiction, really. And I would define addiction by moving habitually moving away from painful experiences, habitually moving away from difficult emotions. And then we could look at the 4 C's of addiction, which is that you keep on moving away from difficult emotions despite the negative consequences. Yeah. And then it's this choice, thinking that you just don't have the choice. Also the compulsion to keep on moving away. Yeah. So yes, codependency can be an addiction, and it can be a matter of life and death. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your 8 steps? You know, we're talking about addiction, we're talking about codependency of racism. How does that help people? How might that help people, your programs around 8 steps?
Yeah. So I just wanted to just finish off, because I realized I didn't mention all the 4 C's of addiction. Because there's also the craving. And I think with codependency, although we might not call it craving, but just compelled to take care of other people's dysfunction. And then that loss of control. You know, it's like you're completely out of control. Yeah. So definitely codependency can be an addiction, and it's on a spectrum, it's on a continuum. Yeah. So ask me your other question again.
I was just curious how you could relate the codependency of racism into your 8-step programs.
Well, I suppose we've partly answered that question, because if we see codependency as an addiction, as an addictive behavior, then we can begin to unravel that and actually look at what I would say there is a vicious cycle of racism. Yeah. And there would be the white person's vicious cycle of racism and the black person's vicious cycle of racism. And really within the 8-step program is really for people to actually see what's going on for them, to really empower and just see how, oh yeah, this is something that I'm habitually doing. And I would really talk about my MBAR program really than the 8-step program. Well, both of them actually intersect, because if we think of the first step of the 8-step is just accepting that this human life will bring suffering. Yeah. It's a really hard one to get our head around. But I know that when I accepted that this human life will bring suffering, it gave me freedom, because I thought I was the only person who suffered. Yeah. And then if we look at the second step of seeing how we create extra suffering in our lives, and I could really see as a black person living in a white world, some of the ways I was creating extra suffering in my life. Didn't mean that the suffering went away. In fact, there's the great quote, before enlightenment is chopping the wood and hauling the water, and after enlightenment is chopping the wood and hauling the water. So the same stuff happened, but I was just less reactive, didn't get hooked into it. Yeah. And that's easy for me to say that because I've had years of practice of mindfulness. A lot of those young kids on the streets hadn't had the practice of mindfulness. So I'm able to connect to the body, connect to the breath. Those young kids out on the streets were connecting to anger because we all need some kind of connection. Yeah. So what I would say is with the 8-step program and the mindfulness-based addiction recovery program, it really gives you tools to be able to live in this world and have some more freedom. So when we look at the codependency of racism, yes, codependency as addiction, let's look at some of our habitual behaviors. Yeah. I, for myself, used to pass as white. And you might think, how on earth can you do that being as dark and as black as you can? But yeah, I passed as white, okay? There's a white way of being, yeah. And it would be like, oh, you're different, you're not like the rest. And I'd pass, yeah, I'm not like the rest. Oh, you're different, yeah. That codependent behavior, yeah. And I did that because I was raised as I was raised by white people, once upon a time. That codependent behavior. I was too scared to be around black people just in case white people wouldn't like me. Yeah. Having dreadlocks was a real statement because it's like, oh, dreadlocks, and you've really become black. Yeah. So there's all this behavior that we can just toss away. Yeah.
Thank you. I think a lot of this is just me sitting here hearing you and absorbing all of this, and I just so appreciate you talking with us. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, and I just want to say that I am quite inspired at the moment. There is a lot happening out there in the world, and I think all people are tapping into that epigenetic wisdom that all of us have. All of us, no matter what race we come from, we all have it. The witches are meeting, yeah. Ancestor groups are meeting, white fragility groups are meeting, black healing groups are meeting. There is so much happening out there. So I'm really inspired. We're in a moment where there is the potential for change. I don't believe in hope because hope hasn't got us anywhere.
Right.
Hope is, I think, is an aspect of codependency. We hope, we don't do anything. But there is possibility. There is the potential for something new to emerge. And let's hope we galvanize that and act on that, because the moment will go. The moment will go. And we have to really act on this possibility of change. Yeah.
Thank you, Valerie. Will you share a little bit about the gift that you have for everybody?
Yes, it was a gift. The gift. I remember when COVID-19 kicked in, and I realized, like, what could I do to help, to be of use? And I realized that the one thing that I was in a situation of generosity, being able to give in different ways. And one of the things I wanted to give was my course on working with anger, fear, and hatred. Yeah, so it's a self-guided course. It's from my book, based on my book, Detox Your Heart. And I think it's really relevant because we're in the midst of two pandemics, the pandemic of COVID-19 and the pandemic of racism. Mm-hmm. And both of those pandemics have activated anger, fear, and hatred from all our different communities. And so I offer you this gift.
Thank you. And everyone watching, there's a button below that you can click on to head over to Valerie's site to grab that. Do you have any last insights? Anything else you want to share before we wrap up?
Just place a hand on your heart after listening to this, and just listen to the body. And just notice if you are feeling constricted, if you're feeling expansive. And just notice that. Notice if there's some activation, activation of anger, frustration. Notice if you have thoughts of disagreeing. It's all okay. Just notice what's going on for you. To me, this is how we break the chains of codependency, of really getting in touch with the body. What does the body want to do right now? Because often when we're in codependent relationships, we do stuff, but we don't really want to be doing it. We don't listen. So, just take a moment to listen to this beautiful body of yours. And if you're able to, take an intentional inhale and just release. Release kindness throughout the whole body. So with ending with this, just having a sense of your own hand giving you kindness, the warmth of kindness. Feel the warmth of kindness on your chest, on the cleavage area, or you may have your hand on the belly. And just as you breathe, and your body can naturally breathe, breathing in kindness from your own hand and releasing the kindness throughout the whole body. Just trust. Trust in the body.
Thank you. It's beautiful. Thank you for being here with us today, Valerie. I so appreciate you.
Thank you. Again, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. And thank you everyone who's watching or listening right now for showing up for yourself, for showing up for this conversation, and we'll see you again real soon. Take care. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this latest class with Dr. Valerie Mason-John. We talked about the codependency of racism. I really hope that you were able to tune into this conversation and really absorb what Valerie was discussing with us and really be present to this conversation and all of the things that it may have brought up for you. And I really just want to leave you with one take-home message, and this was around the conversation we had of trauma bonding. Valerie talked to us about how trauma bonding is connecting at the level of the wound, and how she has shifted into connecting at the place of joy instead of connecting at the place of the wound. And I just think this is a beautiful affirmation, a beautiful practice, a beautiful thing that we could all take into our day today. So I just invite you to look at yourself and where could you connect at the place of joy today instead of at the place of the wound, and just take that out into your day and see how you can apply it in your life. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.